Hello, and welcome to the final stream in my series of AAA game development or AAA character modeling streams. This is going to be the last stream that I do for this series, and today I'm going to be talking almost exclusively about hair cards. What goes into making hair cards, how to set up UVs for hair cards, how to bake out information for hair cards for just some pretty basic stuff. How you can sort of apply lessons that you might have learned from last week's streams in making hair cards. And I'm going to be going through the entire process of laying down just some base shapes, some secondary details, and then finally some of the finer fill-in type stuff that I'll be using for hair cards for this crazy werewolf dude. Now, this is the last stream for this series of streams. This series exclusively focused on modeling, but it's not the last stream that I'm going to be doing. I will be taking a break from the sort of game dev related streams for a while, probably over the next month or so, while I work out the curriculum and stuff for my next series of streams, my next workshop. And I'll be posting more information about that as the weeks go on, but that should be starting in in October, probably October 2nd or 3rd, so that's either a Monday or a Tuesday. And it'll be 4 weeks, 8 sessions, and I'll be opening signups through Patreon. My Patreon is the same as my Twitch username. It's just XCK3D, so you can just go on there and search for it. It's pretty easy to find. And basically what I'll be covering over the course of my next workshop and series of streams is texture creation for AAA character models and the different ways that you can create textures, regardless of what type of texture it is. So I'll be going over different ways to create albedo or diffuse textures, different ways to make, specular and gloss, metalness, gloss roughness or specular/metalness. I'll be going over different ways to create and edit normal maps for characters and for all sorts of, hard surface goodness. I'll be talking a lot about the different types of textures that you use and the different ways that you can create each individual one and use each one as a basis for another one. It's going to be a very wide-ranging class, but the overarching theme will be textures. And I'll probably actually be using this guy, this crazy werewolf dude, as the basis for making a lot of those textures, baking out normal maps, and I'll be applying those various textures to this guy, demonstrating different workflows for making those textures and applying them. I'll probably drop it into Marmoset Toolbag or some other engine at some point, and it should be a pretty fun and informative class, and I'm really looking forward to it. So if that's something that seems interesting to you, just, keep an eye out for information about that being posted online. I'm constantly posting stuff on Twitter because I have no actual life. So, yeah, just keep an eye out for that. Now, I do apologize in advance if there is any background noise during tonight's stream. There are some people over taking care of some stuff in another room. I have the door closed, but if you do hear some people talking or laughing or something like that, apologize if it's disruptive, but I've tried to minimize the effects of that, so hopefully things just go perfectly fine tonight. So let's get started talking about hair cards again. I know that we talked about hair cards last week, but it was sort of in the context of generic hair cards for a generic head. But there are many different ways to apply hair cards and many different ways that you can create textures for hair cards and lay out hair cards on different parts of models. Not just for, hair on somebody's head, but also hair, like if I want to sort of break up the silhouette of this guy on his shoulders or something. Now, the entire intent that I have with giving this character hair cards is to do it in a sort of stylized way that, like I said before, breaks the silhouette, but also does things like increase the feeling of volume for his fur and soften the transition between fur and either very short fur that's just going to be textured on, or skin, or whatever else I might have. Something else I want to do with the hair cards for this guy is make it so that this edge, the transition between the garment here, this vest, and the rest of his body, is a little bit fuzzy. I want it to feel like the hair cards are overlapping on top of this garment right here, and I want to make it so that it feels like his neck has a lot more soft volume rather than just having a bunch of weird muscles in there and stuff. So one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on the most tonight is building up volume and building up coverage of hair cards. And there are a few approaches that I'm going to take that will be familiar if you saw my previous stream about hair cards. I'm going to be using a multi-layered approach, which starts from the least specific, like the most general shapes and the most general coverage, and starts to work towards something a little more specific and a little more in line with actually creating some sort of hairstyle. So the first step of creating hair cards is making sure that you have something very consistent, because by their very nature, hair cards repeat a lot, so you're going to need to be able to repeat textures, repeat models, and be able to do things like copy and paste a lot. So with that in mind, one of the things that we need to think of when we're creating hair cards is how many polygons is each hair card using. So if I draw just a simple hair card with this insert mesh brush right now, oops, let me just turn off symmetry so that things are a little easier to work with. If I draw a simple hair card like this, and I turn on the line display here, you can see that it has a certain number of polygons. And those polygons are arranged in such a way that, because it's an insert mesh, it has the initial part of the hair card, which is right here at one end, and then the end right over here, and then the middle is filled up according to whatever the middle section is. Now, I want these sections to be very consistent. I want the same number of polygons for each of these so that it will be very easy for me to UV map all of these hair cards. And the best way to do that is to, one, make sure that you have an IMM brush that does hair selected. In this case, I'm using one by one of my former coworkers, John Nasconi. He's a character artist at Cryptic Studios. And one thing you want to do is turn on dynamic right here. And what that does is it allows you to draw consistently sized hair cards no matter how close you are to the model or how far away you are. The second thing that allows you to do is not just draw consistently sized hair cards, but hair cards with consistent numbers of divisions along their length. So if I go like this, I can count those out. Let's do a slightly shorter, simpler example. Let's do one that's 1, 2, 3, 4 long. So we have the base, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's 8 long. So essentially what it's doing is it's inserting 2 loops for every one section of this drawing, of this curve. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so now we know basically what it's doing on long curves. So now what we want to do is make sure that we're getting the right amount of coverage. Now, to get the right amount of coverage, you first have to start with the largest brush or the largest hair card size that you think you would need, and then go from there. So in this case, I'm going to do a little bit of experimenting. I'm going to see, how long do I want this hair to be? The answer is not super long. And how much coverage do I want to get with these hair cards? And the answer for that is I want to cover a lot of area with the base layer of hair cards so that I don't have to worry about the geometric details of this layer down here peeking through. I want to be able to cover a large area, but I also don't want to have too many polygons just because it'll be kind of awkward to work with. So there are a number of things that I can do to change the number of polygons, and there are a number of things I can do to change the placement as well. So I mentioned this stuff before, but I'm going to just go over it very quickly again. If we go to the brush menu right here, or just drag it over here, one thing that I want to adjust is the depth. I want to make sure that these hair cards sort of poke into the surface a little bit, at least at the outset, so that I can be sure that they're not really breaking the silhouette. This initial layer of hair cards is not meant to break the silhouette. It's only meant to fill in space underneath other hair cards that will eventually break the silhouette. So in addition to changing the depth to something just inside the model, I'm going to come up here to Stroke, Curve, and I'm going to change it so that I have Lock Start turned on right here. What that's going to do is it's going to allow me to draw a line and then pull on the other end of that line while the base right up here stays in the same spot, more or less. That makes it very easy to style hair cards. So now that I have those two options turned on and adjusted to my liking, I'm going to start drawing with really, really wide cards just to get a large amount of coverage, and then from there I'll start refining. And I'm going to start drawing with hair cards that are as short as possible so that I can fit them onto my hair texture, and also so that it will be easy to UV map them and UV map them consistently. So I'm going to be getting into UV mapping probably in the next 45 minutes to an hour, and we'll sort of go from there. So I'm going to do hair cards along the neckline here. I'm not going to do his entire head or his entire shoulders or anything like that, because that'd be too time consuming. That's more of a that's something I would want to take a couple of hours to do and like really nail the look for it, but I do want to at least get some sort of base in here so that I can work with it and demonstrate for you. So I'm going to start first by making some very large curves. Now that's a pretty good size, but it's not quite got the density along the length that I want. And it's also pretty wide, so I'm going to step down a little bit. Let's see what this does for me. Alright. So that's okay. If we turn on line display, you can see that it's made of just 8 polygons. It's 2, 4, 6, 8. That's a pretty manageable number to work with. And with with Lock Start turned on, I can adjust the positioning of this. So, I can adjust the positioning of this so that it's got some nice curve to it and stuff like that. And then I'm going to start drawing another one. So 1, 2. Nope, that's not. 1, 2. There we go. So having a large size for these initial cards allows me to break the silhouette of this neckline, and it allows me to make it feel like there's a lot more depth here than maybe there actually is in the final model. Here we go. I'm going to align these not too carefully, because I do want the hair to feel slightly chaotic. I want it to feel like it has multiple layers that go in different directions. Oops. And we want these base layers to have all the same number of divisions along their length. Let's pull that in. Oops. Not close enough there. There we go. So we'll pull that in so it doesn't break the silhouette too much, just enough to give it some interest. 1, 2. So by having this consistency, in the next steps here, I'm going to be able to export these and retopologize or do UVs for them. And it's going to be a very easy, largely automated process, because I know how many polygons each has. And because I know how many polygons each has, I can do really easy things like align them on the UVs. And I'll show how to do that in just a little bit here. But before I actually get to UVs, what I want to do is finalize the base layer that I have here, which is going to just provide some volume. Oops. And then from there, I'm going to start doing sort of medium detail. All right. So I've got some pretty good coverage right here along the back of his neck. And now that I have just some sort of base layers, I could go up farther on his neck, but that's not really the point right now. The point is just to demonstrate how this works. Now that I have some nice base layer going on, I'm actually going to split these off to their own subtool and then start working on the medium detail layers, which are going to be the ones where I actually build up different volumes and shapes for the hair, before finally getting to the finer stuff where I'm going to be breaking the silhouette a little bit more and adding some more chaos to the general feel of the fur. So let's just break these off to their own subtools. So we're going to go to split hidden. There we go. And one thing that we want to do is merge vertices. So if I come down here to polygroups and I hit auto groups, you'll notice that occasionally you get situations like this where you have a hair strip, but for whatever reason the insert mesh brush didn't quite merge these polygons the way you would want them to. So I'm just going to go up here to modify topology, weld points, and then if we come back here to auto groups, you'll notice that this is now all one group right here. So we've welded those points. That's going to make it much easier to UV map because we'll be able to match that end with the other parts of the hair model in UVs. Alright, so now that we have that off on its own subtool, let's come back to here and start drawing some medium detail hair cards. Now, medium detail hair cards do two things. They break silhouette even farther by making it so that you have much more volume. You don't just have this basic initial coverage, but you actually have nice, big, flowing shapes. And they also do things like support the shapes, the general shapes that these base hair cards make. So instead of just having one hair card, say along here, I might have this one and then 2 or 3 over the top to give that specific lock of hair a bit more volume. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to start adding medium detail hair cards. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to decrease the brush size a bit, like so. Oops. It would help if I was on the right brush. I'm going to decrease the brush size a little, and then I'm going to start getting longer hair cards. Oopsie daisy. Let's make sure that we delete hidden as well, because occasionally we get duplicates here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we want a nice long-ish hair card. And as long as we count the number of divisions in that initial stroke, that's going to give us very consistently length hair cards that, once again, we can easily match the UVs to. So if I come back here, here we go. You notice that I'm putting this along or roughly along this underlying hair card, the large one. And what this is going to do is it's going to start adding more volume and more unpredictability to that shape. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to hide some of the rest of this guy so that we get slightly better performance, because I'm having some hiccups just because I'm streaming and doing ZBrush at the same time, and both of those are very CPU intensive. There we go. That's a little better. All right. So let's add, let's turn off symmetry again. Let's add another hair card here. This one, as long as we have the same number of divisions, should be more or less identical, oops, to the one we just created. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice that I am deliberately putting these directly over the top of the existing hair cards. This is once again to emphasize the volume that we can get by adding more cards. Alrighty. Oh, and it looks like hopefully this works. If not, I can just adjust how I'm working. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yep, okay. So, to make this go a little faster, be a little easier, I'm just going to duplicate this, hide these others, and then I'm just going to do this, and this, and then hide everything else. And delete it. Okay. There we go. Let's turn those hair cards back on and get back to it. This should be a little faster now. Alrighty, so there we go. That's better. Getting a little better performance now since my CPU isn't crying anymore. Alright, here we go. I'm going to start building up volume by making sure that these are laying right on top of each other. Now the good thing about laying out hair cards in this way is that they lay on top of each other and they automatically start to increase volume as you draw more and more of them because they see what's below them and they just automatically get put on top for most of their length. As you can see, I'm building volume pretty quickly and easily. Alright. I can even come from slightly different spots at the start over here and make it seem like we have a bit of tangled hair. There we go. Having things overlaying like this makes it feel like the hair is a little more organic, because what it does is it changes the direction and makes it feel as if the hair is sort of doing its own thing, even if it is tightly art directed by you. There we go. Having hair cards going in slightly different directions, even if they're all supposed to be part of the same clump of hair, makes that hair feel much more organic, because that's something that natural hair actually does. Individual strands of hair never quite follow the same path as whatever's next to them. They always do something very slightly different because there are different forces working on each individual strand. So for our purposes, we're actually going to have some slightly chaotic strands in the texture, and then increase that chaos by having various types of curvature in the model. And we can even increase that curvature even more by not just having some curvature along the length from this axis, but also have different hair cards lifting up off the surface. So, for example, I can draw a hair card like this, and then to give it a little bit more interest and break the silhouette a little more, I can actually lift it up and then do something like this to make it feel like he's got just a very slight cowlick. In this case, I can actually accentuate that feeling by building up the volume for that little cowlick shape by adding on a few more strands, like so. So as you look at this from the side, you can see that it's not just the round shape that we had before, but there's also this kind of curve going up and out. 1, 2, 3, and 4. There we go. Now that's something very important to keep in mind for various different types of hairstyles, whether it's something like this guy where he's just a crazy werewolf dude, or if it's a more naturalistic character. Despite what you might initially think, lots of characters, even ones who are very well kept, will have some chaos in the shapes of their hair, even if their hair is, say, gelled or has been, nicely taken care of. There's still going to be a little element of chaos in the hair, and having different directions in this way will enhance that. Now you notice that as I've been drawing these medium detail hair cards, I've continually kept them the same length for the exact same reasons that I kept the thick bases the same length. I want them to be very easy to UV map so that I can very easily create textures for them. Alright, so from the side, it's not super noticeable right now, but we have increased the volume of hair, and we've successfully broken the silhouette of the neckline here. The next step is to add some simple flyaways and finer hairs to further accentuate some of these big 3D shapes. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to split off the body, and so split hidden, and we'll just make sure that's visible, and then delete hidden in case it didn't. Okay, there we go. So now we're going to once again go a little smaller with our hair cards, and once again keep very consistent lengths. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, say. It's not very fine, but that should be okay. We're just doing this for demonstration purposes. I'll be getting into the nitty-gritty of this on my own time, really. I'll be having a lot more hair cards. The key for these finest hair cards, though, is to really accentuate and smooth out the shapes here. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. So we want these to also be consistent lengths, so it's easy to UV them. And these are going to come in here and follow these curves. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this one is going to follow this curve like this. It might even come up a little bit at the tip like that, just to break that silhouette even more. So we're going to add some more curves to not just break up the silhouette, but also break up some of the larger hair shapes. Because if we have lots of the same hair texture right next to it, right next to each other, it will start to get very repetitive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. There we go. So let's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Accentuate some of these shapes. We can even start maybe along there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They come out like that. And get some volume. Alrighty. So that's a pretty okay start. That's certainly nice and thick enough. So now what we want to do is start thinking about how we're going to texture some of these hair cards. You know, the process that we want to use and the process that we want to use to UV map them. We want very consistent UVs so that they're easy to work with, and we also want to make sure that these UVs or these textures could potentially be used across multiple different hairs, like hair setups, whether it's a wig for one character or a, full body fur like this for another. It's nice to have very consistent hair textures because it allows you to swap things in very quickly and do lots of testing and refining and stuff. So the biggest thing that we're going to keep in mind is that we have 3 different types of hair clumps here. We have the base hair clumps, which are the biggest ones. We have the medium ones, and then we have the finer ones, which we just more or less finished doing for this part of his neck. So how are we going to unwrap that? How are we going to do the UVs and the textures? And what is the quickest way to go about that? So depending upon how many types of hair clumps you have, the number of UV islands that you use is obviously going to be different. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is that consistency is key for hair, because if you're being very consistent, then you don't have to worry about whether or not things look absolutely perfect. You can adjust things later on, but as long as you're consistent, it doesn't matter how you adjust them as much as it does if you're being a little bit inconsistent. So with that in mind, let's split these guys off. Let's see here, split hidden. Alrighty, now I'm just going to hide this and that and that. Come over here. So this is going to be, oops, that's going to be visible. This is going to be medium hair, and this is going to be fine hair, and this is going to be coarse hair. Alright, so we're going to export these different chunks separately so that they're easier to work with, but then we're eventually going to have them all in the same file. So let me just switch over to Moto really quickly just so that I can get some stuff out of the way here. Alright, so now let's export these as hair, coarse, 01, hair, medium, 01, and hair, fine, 01. Okay. Let me just find those on my computer. Go to week 5. And we will import all of these into Modo. Okay, so there are our hair cards. There's our coarse ones, and there's our medium ones. Okay, actually, you know what? We're going to just hit import on all of these and bring them all in the same one all at the same time. There we go, that's going to be better. Nice. Okay, so we have these hair cards. Let's make sure that the appropriate points are welded. Let's see here. Let's go to clean up. Here we go. so now what we're going to do is we are going to take all of these and unwrap them to the same UV set. We're going to do that with each chunk separately, and then we're going to unify them all onto the same UVs. So let's start with the, let's put these down here. There's fine, medium, and coarse. So let's start with the coarse hair. And then work from there. So let's just unwrap these. Okay, so we've got all of these unwrapped nicely, but there's a problem here. Specifically, we can't really tell which end is which, and if we want these to all use the same hair texture or very similar hair textures, it's kind of impossible with them all kind of wiggly and wormy like this. So one thing we're going to do is try to make them as even as possible. So there are multiple ways that you can do this. There's a process that I can use in Modo that should translate fairly well over to things like Maya and Max. For programs like Maya, you're going to want to look into being able to unitize your UVs and then weld edges and stuff like that. But this general process should be able to be, you should be able to replicate it pretty easily in whatever program you use. So, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that they're all oriented correctly. So I'm going to just select all the bases over here and make sure that I know which one is which end is which on the UVs. Okay, so those ones are all pointed off in that direction. So let's just do this. Let's just rotate all of these 180 degrees-ish. And then make sure that these are all just the bases. Yeah, okay. Now I'm going to make these into rectangles. Alright. Now I'm just going to, fit them all into the UVs very uniformly. So you notice that when they're all fit into the same UV space as rectangles, they all have very similar UVs already because they all have the same length. They're all 4 polygons long and 2 across. And I used the same brush size for all of them in ZBrush, so automatically they just will have very uniform UVs. So we're going to align all these perfectly. We're just going to do this. Scale that. Now these UVs don't have to be absolutely 100% perfectly aligned based on, the size of these polygons, because in the end, hair is long, thin, tiny strands, so you don't necessarily have to worry as much about whether or not things are aligned perfectly or there's a little bit of distortion, because you're just not going to notice it with so many overlapping strands. Alright, so there's the base coarse level. Let's just move that out of the way over here. Let's go to the medium hair. Now with this medium hair, we should be able to use the exact same process. Because they're all the same length, at least in theory, and because they were all drawn with the same brush size, and they all have the same number of UVs, we should be able to do the same stuff. So let's do this, and let's just make sure that we are able to select the right ends. Okay. And let's try a different way this time. Let's do rectangle first, and then orient these vertically, and then let's pack them. Alright, so here we go. So let's make sure that we can select all of those ends. Alright, so it looks like there are just a couple that don't have the same alignment as the others, so we'll do this. Okay, there's those ends, and let's do this. Looks like those are those ends. Alright. So that's all of them. They're all pointed in the same direction. Let's just make sure that we can do the same thing as we did for the coarse UVs. Let's just do this. Oopsie daisy. Oh, you know what? Actually, what we can do is go by UV island, keep proportion, and there we go. There we go. Nice. Just gonna align these and those, and oops, that, that, and that. There we go. Now all of those UVs are perfectly aligned. Awesome. And very usable. Now let's see here. If we have these and the rough UVs, the coarse UVs, on the same spot, let's make sure that they're both oriented the same way. There's the base there, and there's the base. Okay, those are all oriented the same direction. Now let's move on to the fine hair and use the same process. We'll unwrap these, make them rectangular, pack them, and make sure that they're all facing the same way. Looks like they are. So let's just rotate them so that their bases are in the same direction as the other UVs, and we're going to fit them into space. Perfect. Let's just align that, and just align the middle. Cool. So we don't necessarily actually need to align any of these middle edges. The main reason I was doing it with the larger UV islands was so that things would be a little more consistent, but we don't really have to worry about that all the time. Alright, now let's just select all of these, pack them, lock the ones that are stacked on top of each other. Oops, and let's make sure that we have that one selected as well. Pack those, lock stacked. Don't orient because we don't want to change the orientation right now. And there we go. So now the last step here is to be able to add variation. Sometimes things that you'll want to do would be to maybe select, say, half of these and then separate them off onto their own area of the UV channel. But you don't necessarily need to do that. I'm not going to be able to, or I'm not going to need to do that since I have so few hair cards here. It's not something that's super important, but if I found that I needed a lot of variety, that's just something I could do. And that's fairly easy to do. You could just, come here, select a few random ones, and then just kind of move them. And there, you're going to have variation now. So one last thing to do is make sure that these are easy to work with. So I'm right-handed, and I find it easiest to draw lines from left to right, from over here to over here, because it's just this simple pull sensation. And what that means for me is that if I'm either drawing a texture in Photoshop or creating something in ZBrush or something like that, I want the base to be over here and the ends to be over here. So I can actually rotate these like so, and then we can repack them and it'll align them along the edges. There we go. So there are all the ends. Alright, so this is great, but one thing that it fails to do for us is give us a good base for texturing if we want to have lots of variation in the textures for these individual areas. So how can we get that kind of variation? Also, how are we actually going to draw our individual hairs to be mapped onto these planes? That's a very good question. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. The way that I'm going to demonstrate tonight is this method that was made by, just one second. Let me see if I can pull up the link to the tutorial. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Here we go. So if you go to 3D Artist Online and look for the tutorial called How Do I Create Real-Time Hair for Games, Tom Parker goes over a very similar process to the one that I've been using. And one of the key things that he does is use curves in ZBrush, and you can get results that look, if it'll actually open up properly, well, you can get results that look like this. They're nice and chaotic and such, which is nice. It's good, and it'll also allows you to do things like add depth, add multiple layers of hair. You can also do things like copy and paste curves and that type of thing. And then you can get really nice effects for it. It's it's a bit of an involved process, but I'm gonna demonstrate how I would do that by opening up this UV map in ZBrush, and then I'm just gonna draw some curves and then bake them out in Marmoset Toolbag, and then we can look at different ways that you can do things like add color variation, just overall color, that type of thing. So let's get started with that. So the first order of business will be to make sure that I can import these UVs into ZBrush to draw those curves on top of them. So there are a few ways that I could do this. One, I could just export an image of the UVs and then import it into ZBrush on a plane or something like that. But actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, this, and this. So I've got one of each of the planes. I'm just going to copy these to a new file. Notice that they're all in the same UVs now. And there's two ways that I can go about what I'm about to do. And what I'm about to do is flatten these out to their UVs. So I can either do that in Modo here, or I can do it in ZBrush. I'm going to do it in Modo since it's a little less finicky than ZBrush tends to be. But you can do it in ZBrush by using UV Master. If you come to UV Master up here, you can click on, things like Work on Clone, and that'll copy things, and then you can flatten whatever you have if it has UVs. And by flattening it out, it just flattens your model to its component UVs, and then from there you can work on it. I don't really like to use that method because working with UVs in ZBrush is a bit finicky, and I prefer to avoid it as much as possible because I know that ZBrush likes to destroy UVs for any number of different reasons. So that's why I'm going to be doing it in Modo. So I'm just going to quickly do that in Modo. If I can remember how. Well, that would be great, wouldn't it? Well, maybe we're going to do it in ZBrush because I don't want to have to go and look that up right now. I just forgot that I forgot it. So we're going to save this. We are going to do it in ZBrush. Even though it's the way I prefer a little less, it's still serviceable. And it'll give us enough of a guide to take us on to the next steps. So let me just save this as UVs base 1. This is in week 5. Okay. Save that as an OBJ and import it into ZBrush. Alright, so here are our different little chunks of hair that we are then going to use as the basis for drawing our hair curves. So if we come up here to this, let's just work on a clone and flatten it. So notice that the UVs are backwards compared to what they should be, but that's just one thing that ZBrush does. Huzzah. Okay, so now we are going to just duplicate that and start drawing some curves. We can draw curves in any number of different ways, but I'm going to use the curve. Oops. Just make sure that we're doing this right. So we're not going to smooth things when we subdivide, and we want enough detail to be able to snap to things. All right, there we go. Delete lower and use curve tubes and just do something along these lines. Probably want to have lock start, turn on. Alrighty, there we go, that's a little better. Turn off perspective so that we don't have any weird depth adjustments or anything going on. And we're just going to start drawing some curves. And actually, before I actually get to that, I'm going to turn on lazy mouse so that I can do a little bit smoother curves. Here we go. Now it's a little thick, so I'm just going to adjust my brush size to be a little bit smaller. Yeah, that's pretty good. Alright, here we go. So what this is going to do for us is allow us to make actual 3D hairs that we can then adjust. So for example, if this thing is interpenetrating with other hairs and I don't want it to, I can just come here from a distance and just pull it around, adjust its positioning, and then draw other hairs. Oops. There we go. Now there are a couple of different ways that we can bake the output from this. One is to just use things like masking and baking in ZBrush, but ZBrush is notoriously difficult to work with when it comes to baking, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output from this and put it into Toolbag and bake from there. And that'll allow me to do a few things, but the key thing is that I will be able to get lots of usable textures from it very quickly, since Toolbag bakes very quickly and easily. Oops. There we go. Now, having this kind of chaos in your texture with lots of overlapping textures, or lots of overlapping hairs that eventually start building up volume, is a good thing. Especially having multiple different lengths like this. Even after you get a haircut, you're never going to run into a situation where you have exactly the same length of hair in any given place, just because hair moves around a lot even when you're cutting it, so you get very chaotic ends to your hair. Oops. Make sure we're at the right angle. There we go. And by having hairs that cross over each other, you end up building up nice shapes and getting lots of nice indications of chaotic movement in the hair. You do occasionally want to have things that cross in other directions so that it feels like the hair is natural and is slightly tangled, maybe. Because hair naturally tends to tangle just the same way that, say, headphone cords in your pocket do. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to lay these out, and then eventually, once we have enough of these curves laid out, we're going to do a few adjustments to them to make sure that they're not overlapping too much or too little. And then we're going to do things like taper these tubes very quickly and easily. Oops. Here we go, making sure that we have nice varied lengths.
building up some volume, especially in areas like this. Here we go. So these are going to be the main directions for the hair. We're going to build everything off of these main directions. Here we go. We want to make these sort of hairlock shapes, like so, just by building things up slowly. And once again, we want lots of different lengths of hair to make it feel like it's a little more volumetric. And like there's a little bit of chaos in there. That's good. That always helps us. Helps it feel more natural, and it just generally makes things a little bit easier to work with. Here we go. Okay, so now that we have lots of these hair strands, these hair strands laid out on the hair cards, we're going to do a few things. First and foremost, we're going to move a lot of these hair strands so that they're not interpenetrating with each other, so that we can get a better feeling of volume. And we're going to move some stuff around to sort of add some clumping or remove some clumping. And then finally, we're also going to taper some of these hair strands. And there are a couple of ways you can taper things, but really we're just going to be smoothing stuff and then going from there. So now if you notice, if we turn off lines, each of these hair strands is on its own polygroup. And what that means for us is that we can easily use those polygroups to add some color variation to the hair. So we're going to do that in some later steps, but for now we're just going to split off the actual cards to their own subtools and have the hair strands on their subtool. So let's just split hidden. Okay, and we can hide that. Now we have lots of stuff that's interpenetrating, like in this area. So we're just going to use the topological move brush and just move some stuff in and out so that things aren't looking so gross. I'm just going to do that like so. And it's okay if the hairs go sort of snaking in and out between each other. That adds a little bit more believability because hair is three-dimensional and it does move in 3D space. So we want to kind of encourage that feeling by doing this type of thing. Now it's okay if there are still some interpenetrations because you're not going to see all of them, especially at the resolution that hair is usually rendered at. But you just want to get rid of some of the most egregious examples. For example, this pink right here is just a little bit too much, so we can just do this type of thing. There we go. That's better. Okay. Let's just move this back here, and that there. We can add a little more space in here. Do this and that. This doesn't have to be super exact. It's okay if it's a little bit off in some places because nobody's actually going to be noticing. When these are actually rendered in game, they might only be, half a pixel wide, so the anti-aliasing is going to take care of them and just blur them into one mass. The main thing you don't want to have is too much volume in one place so that things feel lumpy or gross or anything like that. So that's what we're doing right now. We're just making it so things aren't lumpy. They don't have to be perfect, they just don't want to be grody. Here we go. Getting rid of some of those interpenetrations. Lots of clipping still, but that's okay. We just want to minimize things. We don't want to completely eliminate it because that's a level of obsession that we don't want to get to. Alrighty. Now things are looking better. Most of the weird interpenetrations are less noticeable. Let's just go down to this last example down here. Let's give it some more depth. Decrease some of this clipping, like so. Alrighty. Pull this green one out, and that yellow one. Here we go. And there we go. That's pretty good. Let's just do it right here and right here. And there might be some left, but I'm not really going to worry about it too much because we're not going to be looking super closely at most of these areas. So now that we have these hair strands laid out very nicely, I'm just going to duplicate these so that in case I screw something up, we don't have any problems. We can go back to an earlier version. And I'm going to now do a couple of things. One, I'm just going to smooth these. I'm just going to use the smooth tool and just do this so that we get some nice taper in here. So they taper towards the ends. There we go. Oops. It's not quite what I wanted to happen. There we go. So let's smooth these out. There we go. Now, these are going to make some nice hair cards. Now, one more thing that I want to tweak or adjust is the overall thickness that we have here. Now, these are very thick for being hairs. Hairs are just teeny tiny fractions of a millimeter wide. Even with the thickest hair. So we want these to be noticeably thinner. So to accomplish that, we can actually come down here to deform, or deformation rather, and we can deflate them a little bit by, say, -1. That might be a little extreme, but it might work. If it is extreme, we can come into some of these places and inflate them. And yeah, it looks like, let's just deflate it by 0.5. There we go, that's a little better. And we can continue smoothing these so that they all match nicely. That's better. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now it's okay if on the more detailed strands like this, the hairs are a little bit thicker because you're going to want to use some of that volume. But in general, you want things to be fairly thin like this. Okay, so I mentioned before that having color variation like this can be a good thing. Now, how can we use that? That's a very good question, and I will show you how over the next few steps. But the general use for color variation, like you see here with these different polygroups, is to use them as poly paint and then bake out a texture that has that poly paint on it. So we can do that in Marmoset Toolbag. So I'm going to come in here, just do that, and then come to poly paint, do poly paint from polygroups, and that's going to give us some slightly more vibrant colors here. Then when we export this as an OBJ, we can do hair high 01, and what that will allow us to do is export a poly paint texture, which we can then use to give color variation, whether it's in Photoshop or whatever other texture program we use. Alright, and let's export these UVs, because this model is what we're going to be using to bake these textures. So if we export this as low. This is what we're going to bake onto. So if we come over here to Marmoset Toolbag, we're not going to download that update right now, but we're going to load some models in here. So we're going to do hair low and hair high. Just drag them in. Oh, just open those up real quick. Okay, so here you can see that I've got the high hair model and the low hair model. And I'm just going to move this low hair model back. Oops. Let's move this back a little bit, and let's just apply a default texture or material to it so we can see a little better. So here you can see our baking setup. So we have our background models, and then we have our hair, which we're going to bake now. So we're just going to make a quick baking group. We're going to bake this to just one layered PSD, so we'll just call this hair. We're going to select multi-layer PSD. We're just going to, let's just bake everything. Actually, we're not going to make material ID. Or position or height, but we might want to use the normals. The albedo, specular, and gloss, we're going to be creating that on our own anyway. But the vertex color is one that we definitely want. So if we take a look at this default matte, we can change this in albedo to vertex color. And we can change diffusion to Lambertian. Now if we if we select vertex color in here, let's do this, and then probably want reflectivity set to specular, and reflection set to GGX, if that's actually going to work for us. And it's still being kind of funky, so we'll just make a new matte and just drag that on there. That's just a plain old default material. We'll change this to vertex color. There we go. Now we can see things. That's better. So you can see the the vertex colors, the polypaint was exported from ZBrush, and we can bake that out now. And one thing that we're going to do when we go to bake this, let's put the high in there and the low in there. When we go to bake this, we need to make sure of a few things. One, we need to make sure that it's actually going to capture all the detail. So we're going to push out the offset for the cage here. Let's make sure that that's it's still not capturing anything right there, so we'll push out even farther. There we go. So we're going to bake this, and we're going to turn off padding. So by turning off padding, what that's going to do for us is it's going to give us very crisp lines without any sort of padding between any high poly islands on the UVs. We're also going to increase the samples just in case, and turn on the soften filter. And let's not do ambient occlusion right now because that is going to take a little bit of time. But now let's just bake this and see what we've got. It's going to take a second. Now we can hide the high poly and turn on vertex color. Here you can see that by baking the vertex color, you get this handy dandy map that you can use for masking, or you can recolor it in Photoshop depending upon the colors that you have. There's a lot of stuff that you can do here. Now it looks like we don't have any anti-aliasing on there, so we're probably going to have to bake it at a little bit of a higher resolution and then resize down. So we're going to bake that at 4096 and just resize it in Photoshop later. Alrighty. That's a lot better. It's a lot more detailed. It's a lot more usable for us because we're going to be able to resize it down to something that has a lot more anti-aliasing on it. So here we also have curvature. You can see that you get the curvature of the individual strands. We can take a look at the normals, and you can actually get strand normals. That's handy. And by making this at a higher resolution, once again, you get nice padding. Now, you will notice that in these areas where it overlaps, that soften filter actually didn't help us. It kind of decreased the amount of information that we have to differentiate these two strands from each other. So we're gonna let's turn that back down again and see what happens. Take a second to actually bake this information. But yeah, that's a lot more crisp in there now. That's better. Yeah, that's pretty good. So one other good thing about having a vertex color map like this, actually without any sort of anti-aliasing, that's a good thing, because we can select all of the black stuff and make sure that that is the alpha channel of our texture. Alright, so now that we have some basic hair textures baked out, let's load those into Photoshop and see what we've got. Let's just put Photoshop right up here. Load our hair texture, which has multiple layers on it right now. So this is baked at 4K. Let's turn off rulers. Alright, so you can see that we've got some nice detail. There's even some object space normal map. Some nice detail for each of our little hair strands. So one last thing that I'm going to do is come back here into Moto and just export these UVs to a file that I can then load into, export UVs to EPS. Just load that. Save that in our folder as hair UVs. We're going to change the bound size to 4096 just to match our other textures, and then we're going to import it into Photoshop so that we can make some nice masks and stuff. So let's open that. Oops, wrong folder. We'll just do this. We'll just drag it in. Here we go. 4096. We'll set this to RGB. Turn off anti-aliasing so we can get nice selections. Copy and paste this into here, and now we've got the lines of the UVs. Perfect. So now we have some really nice bases for hair textures. So what can we do with this? How can we use all of this stuff to actually create hair textures? Well, there are a few different ways that you can utilize all of these different textures in the creation of hair. First and foremost, we want to actually create an alpha map so that our hair can be transparent on all of these cards. So the way that we're going to do that is to, wrong one. We're going to use the vertex color. We're going to select everything. We don't want it to be contiguous because we want to select all the black. Don't want any tolerance. I'll just click in there, make a new layer, invert the selection, fill it with white, and there you go. There is your alpha map. So if we do this, we can select a new, or we can make a new, let's make a new texture at 4096. Do this at 4096 by 4096. Paste that in there. Turn that black. And we can actually flatten that and copy it into the alpha channel right here. And this is a pretty good start for a texture. So if we load this back into Toolbag, let's just fill this with a simple gradient from, say, black to brown. So we're going to do this, or maybe not black, but certainly a dark color. So we're going to do this. I don't want to be super saturated. And then this is going to be, maybe something along these lines. So we're just going to make a nice gradient. That's going to be our hair texture. It might be a little too saturated. Let's just crank down the saturation on here. That's a little better. Alright, so now we can actually load this back into Marmoset. So this is going to be hair, albedo. We can dump that straight into here by just doing this. Oops. Turn that off. Alrighty. Where did that texture go? Oh my goodness. Terrible. Simply terrible. Here we go. Put that in there, and this on all of the low polys. So here you can see a little bit of that gradient, and now if we go here to transparency, we can just do cutout. It's going to take a second, and there you go. Now you have some transparent hair. Awesome. So if you want to have some color variation in your hair, we can then use things like, oops, let me just close that. So we don't need that anymore. We can use things like the vertex color and do things like apply gradient maps to this. So for example, I could, let's just desaturate this. That's no good. Let's do some levels on this, like so. Adjust the hue. Okay. And we can do a gradient map. What that's going to allow us to do is something like we just did before, like so. And it's not super visible right now, but we do have a bit of color variation. So we can add some, for example, we can add another stop in here and change this to like a lighter tannish color, so like this, maybe. There we go. You can add some more colors in here to do things like this. Like that. Alrighty. So now we have some nice color variation in that hair. We just copy and paste that into this texture. Maybe have that as an overlay. Save that, and now when we come back here, we can find that, let's turn down the specular intensity a bit. Oops, make sure that we have some nice levels adjustment in here. There we go. Alright. Make sure that this is actually bright enough as well. But yeah, that's a general nice way to create some color variation in your hair. And if you want to, you can also change some settings to do things like this, to have more color peeking out. And finally, one thing you can do is use your curvature map to add a little bit of depth around edges. So we can change that to say overlay. And if we zoom in here, you can see that it adjusts things, adds a little bit more depth. So we can save that. And it's not super, super visible, but if you come in here, zoom in like so, you do start to see a little bit of color variation. All right, so that's the general process that you can use for creating hair. And there are variations to this that you can do. For example, you can say take this nice alpha map texture and you can do things like this where you copy it and then you move it, or you say flip it somehow so that you can add variation to the hair that you already have. This is something that I've used a lot in a lot of different cases. You can do all sorts of stuff in that same way. You can change this so that it's not quite as long this way. You can have more overlap at the base of the hair. Lots and lots and lots of different options, and each one, adding more and more complexity and more layers like that adds thickness to the hair, and it also adds a little bit more chaos and makes it feel a little bit more believable depending upon what you're doing. Now this is extremely high res right now, so you might want to actually, we can flatten this and copy it to a new layer or a new document, and then we can downsample this to say either 2048 or 1024. And that's going to add some anti-aliasing. You'll notice that it blurs around the edges as it gets smaller. That's always very handy. Other things that you can do to adjust your hair cards are add things like not just color gradients, but opacity gradients as well. So for example, I could add a gradient that goes like so at the base of the hair, and that's going to make the base of the hair fade in a bit. Just change this like so. So I can save that, and then, wait, it might help if that was actually copied to the alpha instead of just living in the diffuse. So we can do this. Oops. We can save that. Come in here. Oh, make sure that, save that. There we go. And if we come down here to say dithered alpha, it's going to fade things in nicely. So yeah, there's a lot of different options, lots of different things you can do. By adjusting the threshold, you can do more stuff. You can also add some color variation to make that threshold different. So, for example, I could come in here and do this. Oops. Desaturate that. Do some levels adjustment. And then multiply this, or do any number of other operations, and on a hair-by-hair basis, it might be longer or shorter in this area. So yes, lots and lots of different options for creating hair cards, but that's the general process that that I have used in the past, that a lot of people I know use, and it generally provides pretty solid results, say 90% of the time. Now, this doesn't mean that it's a perfect one-stop solution. There are lots of things that you can do and have to do to actually get it to work properly. So, for example, the the hair cards that you see here on the back of this neck are not going to be completely finalized because you're still going to have to do a lot of work once you get all the textures on here, to make sure that things line up properly, you have the right amount of volume and fill. You might need to do things like change the direction of some of these cards, or duplicate some of them to get the right amount of thickness. But that's the general workflow that you can use to get hair working. Now, if you want to do stylized hair, there are things you can do with, say, thicker insert mesh brushes, or thicker tubes. If you're drawing with curved tubes, you can use larger ones, or you can use insert meshes like this one, where it draws a long tapered shape. There are lots and lots and lots of different options that are available to you for creating different types of hair cards. So if you want to create hair cards, look into these different options and see what your options are and see what's going to be best. Sometimes creating hair cards from scratch in whatever 3D program you use is the best option because it gives you the most control. Sometimes you have something like Ornatrix or XGen or whatever that is going to allow you to bake hair cards in different ways. This is just one way to do hair cards, but this is the way that I've found works well for the way that I prefer to work. So we've got about half an hour left in this this final session. So if you have any questions and you want to ask about basically anything game dev related, whether it's related to hair cards or modeling or getting into the industry or something like that, feel free. Drop those questions in the chat. I'll be more than happy to answer if I can. If I can't, I'll try to direct you to resources where you can find answers. But for the next half hour, I'm just going to be doing stuff like tweaking that texture, working on a little bit of UVs for the body for this guy, and other general stuff. And then I'm going to be shutting things down for the final time for this series and going into the private hangout with the folks who signed up for it. If you want to see more stuff like this, if you want to, maybe check out my next workshop where I talk about texturing and stuff, just, check out my my Twitter account or something. There's a link down to it right below the video here on Twitch, and just keep an eye out for announcements because I'm always posting stuff on there. So I'm gonna get into some UVs for this guy's body now, specifically the low poly body, which is gonna be right in here, and I'm just gonna be hanging out, doing some stuff very quickly, and then shutting things down. So thank you guys for coming by. Thank you for watching and listening and participating. It really means a lot to me seeing people come in and engage with me on all these things that I'm working on. So it's always great to see lots of people on here. So yeah, if you have questions, comments, anything along those lines, feel free to shoot them at me, and I'll see if I can help. I'm going to be shutting down the stream in about half an hour now, so yeah, just keep that in mind. I'm going to now just finalize the low poly for this guy. I'm going to close off his ears and stuff. So let's get that started, shall we? Let's make sure that we've got the high poly and the low poly. There we go. So we can go to topology mode and start closing off his ears and finalizing everything. There is some optimization that I want to do back here because the back of his ear shouldn't be that dense, probably. Certainly not more dense than the front of his ear, which is the part you're going to see most of the time, so I'll be adjusting that too. One way I can do that is deleting this stuff. Here we go. Do this. Alrighty, so I can pull this up like that, like so. so that's pretty good. Now I can delete that edge, and things are looking a lot better. Almost ready for UVs. Can live there as a 5-sided polygon, that's fine. It's not in an area where we're going to be seeing it a hell of a lot. And it just looks fine once it's subdivided. So let's just delete one half of this so that I can easily mirror things over. So one question I've got in chat right now is who taught me these workflows for Marvelous Designer and Hair? Did I come up with a lot of it on my own? It sort of depends on the different parts of the workflow you're talking about. I did learn a lot about creating hair from some of Tom Parker's work. He's a really good artist, and he knows his stuff. So I learned a lot about making hair from him. I also learned a bit from some of my current coworkers, and a lot of it was also just experimenting with different workflows to find the one that worked best for me. As for the Marvelous Designer workflow, a lot of it is stuff that I sort of came up with on my own. Certainly I've been constantly looking at other people's stuff to sort of see what I can use as far as other workflows are concerned, but I've found that the workflow that I use for Marvelous Designer has mainly been stuff that I've sort of come up with on my own as, out of necessity, just because I hadn't quite found results that worked well for me beforehand, and so I worked hard to establish something that I could repeat and would work well under a number of different circumstances. So as far as Marvelous Designer goes, that's what I use. Or sorry, as far as like Marvelous Designer and stuff goes, a lot of it was based on my own work that I did, whether it's making models in Marvelous Designer or transferring from Marvelous Designer to ZBrush. A lot of it was just lots of trial and error. Now, as far as actually working in Marvelous Designer as opposed to going from Marvelous Designer to something like ZBrush, I did learn a lot from Seth Nash. He's an artist who is currently, I think he might be at Dice LA now. I can't quite remember, but he's a good friend of mine, and he's very, very accomplished at making stuff in Marvelous Designer. He really knows what he's talking about, and so he's suggested several things to me workflow-wise that I've found have been very helpful, whether it's using different types of materials in Marvelous Designer to represent different parts of clothing or any number of other things. His workflows are very solid, and I learned a lot from him. The general workflow that I use to go from Marvelous Designer to ZBrush, though, is more or less something that I came up with. So what else we have here? Is there a max poly count that you would typically spend on hair cards for a main character who is a human? That typically depends on the type of restrictions you're looking at as far as how the character is being used in the game. So for example, if you have a big open world game that has lots of side characters just kind of running around all the time, say like civilians or something like that, in that case you're going to have much tighter restrictions than on a main character. So, I mean, there isn't necessarily a hard maximum number, but you are going to run into much tighter numbers on a character that isn't, say, a main character. Now, with that in mind, I have created characters that had hair that, just the hair had as many polygons as a secondary character. And the main reason for that is that it was a main character and it required a lot of detail because it was going to be seen in close-ups constantly. So, for example, I'm working on Spider-Man for the PS4 right now, and we recently released a trailer during GDC, or not GDC, during E3, and the main bad guy, Mr. Negative, he's in that trailer. I worked on him. I worked on his hair and basically every other part of him. I had a lot of help with him, and I can't discount that help. I had a lot of help from Gavin Goulden and several other artists on the character team, but I was in charge of most of implementing that model and all of his textures in the game. And his hair, before some optimizations and stuff took place, was actually above 100,000 triangles just for the hair, because he is going to be on the screen almost as much as, say, Spider-Man is. He's the main bad guy, so obviously he needs to be very detailed, and he has to hold up under lots of different lighting conditions and stuff. So his hair had as many triangles as most of the civilian characters in the game, or even more than most of the civilian characters in the game. Now, after several optimization passes and dialing things in with our shader artists and such, we did manage to reduce that number, both through smarter hair card use and better shaders, so that it's about half that, but you're still looking at 50,000 triangles for just some hair. So those are the different types of numbers you can run into on these types of characters. You can have just some hair that has as many or more triangles as something that's not going to be seen as often. You may also find, depending upon what type of technology you're working with and how familiar your say graphics engineers are, or your rendering engineers are, with the pipeline that you're using and the rendering software, whether it's Unreal 4 or some proprietary in-house engine, that you might be able to use more or less detail in hair. So a lot of it also comes down to the technology that you have at your fingertips. And obviously this is also going to be something that changes on a case-by-case basis depending upon things like the hairstyle. If you look at the polygon budgets for a game like Horizon Zero Dawn, the main character's hair, the main character Aloy, her hair alone, just her hair, had over 100,000 triangles. And that was in the final shipped game. So certainly there are no hard limits for this type of thing, and a lot of it comes down to making sure that the technology that you have can support what you want to make. Alright, so there's some stuff that we can do to optimize this ear even further. Like so. So I'm going to cut these like this. Come across here. There we go. That's going to be a little better. Cut across there. There. There we go. So another question I'm getting is, this might be more related to shading, but to use flow maps for hair, and do you have any tips or workflows for creating them? Currently, we're not using flow maps for hair on Spider-Man, though we have talked about it. Not for any specific technical reason, more just that we haven't really needed to use them. But I have used flow maps in the past. And in case you're not familiar with this, flow maps are it's an RGB texture that defines a direction, similarly to a normal map. And what it does is it takes the highlight of the hair and stretches it in one direction or another to give it a nice anisotropic highlight, which means that the highlight is sort of stretched in one direction along the polygons so that it looks more like a bunch of little tubes stuck together as opposed to just one solid block. Currently, I don't use any flow maps just because I haven't had any specific reason to, but I have used them in the past. And if you want to make flow maps or direction maps, I would suggest using, there's a program called Krita or Krita, I'm not sure of the exact pronunciation, but it's a 2D painting application that has a painting mode which allows you to paint actual directions in the same way that you would use a flow map or a direction map. Let me see, it's called let's see here, Krita Normal. One second. It's the Tangent Normal Brush in Krita. That's Krita. And there are some tutorials available online for it. But that, as long as it's set up correctly, that allows you to very quickly create flow or direction maps, which are very useful for getting shading on hair looking correct. So that's generally what I would suggest if you're going to use direction maps. It's also possible to create them in Photoshop, which I have done in the past, but it ends up being a little bit more of a pain than it's worth just because it's so difficult to work with that type of information in Photoshop. So I'd suggest using Krita or Krita, or however it's pronounced. I'd suggest using that as opposed to painting them in Photoshop. This is looking okay. Just need to adjust some of the polygon flow around here. I can finish off the ears and get to the UVs. Let's see here. Alrighty. Okay, here we go. Now these ears are almost completely ready to go. And they should subdivide nicely. So let me just cap these off and finally get to the final UVs for this body. That'll be nice to get to. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to be on here for roughly another 15 minutes. So if you have any more questions, feel free to ask. And this is the last in this series of streams, so I'm open to other types of questions that aren't necessarily related to hair cards or modeling. And yeah, keep in mind that in October I will be doing another set of streams very similar to this, and it's going to be focused entirely on creating textures and the various ways that you can create textures, both for realistic and stylized work. So that should be pretty fun. I think people are going to like talking about that type of stuff because people generally like talking about shading and textures and materials and that type of thing. Certainly a lot more than most modeling stuff. So it should be pretty cool. It should be pretty interesting. Oopsie daisy. And you know what? It's looking a little overly detailed up there. So let's do this. Let's get rid of some of this extraneous detail by doing this again. Just come up here, cut this like so. Like that, and like this. surface. There we go. It's still pretty dense around the end of the ear right there, but nowhere near as bad as before. So let's just delete these. And come around like so. This is one of the parts that I love the most, when I'm finally getting to that last little detail right before I get to UVs. And I do like doing UVs, but this is one of those bits where I know that I'm getting close to finished. So what kind of study or practice did you do to improve your anatomy knowledge? Did you just sculpt lots of people and body parts? That's a good question. And it's sort of a multi-part answer, but in general, yeah, I did just sculpt lots of people and body parts and stuff. A lot of it just came down to doing what I needed to get the job done. So there are still areas where I can improve my knowledge and application of anatomy, but the anatomy that I feel I'm strongest with right now, a lot of it actually came from taking figure drawing classes many moons ago. Learning to draw figures certainly helped me in my knowledge of where muscles lie, but even more than that, it helped in learning how muscles are actually used. And if you know how muscles are used, it becomes a lot easier to understand why they're laid out the way they are, and it gives you a slightly better intuitive understanding of how you can represent them either in drawings or in 3D space. And even if you don't necessarily know all the names of muscles or anything like that, it still gives you a good solid understanding of what you can and should or can't or shouldn't do with say anatomy sculpts or drawings or anything like that. It provides you with a nice basis for everything else that follows after. So if I was going to suggest something, it would be to go and take some traditional figure drawing classes and really drill down hard into making sure that you're able to draw muscles in perspective and that type of thing, because those are things that are going to help you not just in modeling stuff, but also in communicating with people about different types of models that you are making, and it'll help you with your ability to do things like self-critique or critique other people's work. It'll give you the tools that you need to be able to see how you can or should improve. So I would highly recommend that if you have the opportunity, you take some figure drawing classes or just go to open figure drawing workshops. Though I have found that figure drawing classes are useful because often the teacher knows some good ways to represent different forms of anatomy that you might not consider, and there'll be ways that can sort of help you represent those forms in 3 dimensions as well. Alrighty, almost done here. Just need to fix up a couple small areas, and then the model will be finished, or at least this part of the model. There's still a little bit of work that I need to do to add things like claws and whatnot, but that'll go pretty quickly. Alrighty. That's a good feeling. Alright, let's just make sure that this is all uniform and centered along the x-axis. Mirror that. Make sure that everything's closed up, which it is. Alrighty. Oops, wrong Wrong one. And there we go. So now this model I'm going to be bringing into ZBrush. I'm going to project some details on it, refine some shapes, and then use it as the low poly. There are a couple of areas like this right here that I need to just adjust a little bit, but nothing major. Alrighty, so we're coming down to just the last few minutes here, and then I'm going to be hopping into the private hangout to do the last hangout session of this whole workshop thingamajig. If you have any more questions, please feel free to let me know in the chat here. So here's one. What are your thoughts on the Gnomon panel you went to last week? Well, obviously I'm a bit biased because I work with the guys who were on that Gnomon panel, but I thought it was pretty good. I thought that they provided a lot of good answers to people's questions, and I thought that people also had some good questions to ask them. I think there's always more time to give more answers and stuff, but I thought that in the allotted amount of time, they did a really good job, and I didn't have anything that I disagreed with. I work with these guys on a daily basis, and I find that they're pretty smart cookies, and they know their stuff. So yeah, I don't really have anything to add. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, or if you weren't here last week or didn't hear about that Gnomon panel, there was a panel at the Gnomon workshop where three of my coworkers, Gavin Goulden, Jason Hickey, and Brian Weiser, the respective leads of the character team, the environment team, and the cinematic animation team from Insomniac, did a panel discussion and then took questions. And it was mostly directed at people who want to get into the game industry and who aren't sure about how working in a professional game development environment works. So that's what this question was all about. And yeah, like I said, I consider these guys to be sort of at the top of their field. They're really good at what they do. They're very smart people, and there's a reason that they're in leadership positions, because they're able to get their jobs done and make sure that their teams are working well. And these guys sort of help their teams by acting not as just sort of directors, but also as a buffer between their team and other teams where that buffer might need to exist. So they're very good at their jobs, and I appreciate all the work that they do because they work very hard at their jobs. Not sure if there was any other specific part to that question, but we still have a couple minutes here, so if you had something that you wanted to clarify about that question, feel free to let me know in the chat. But otherwise, yeah, I thought it was good, and yeah, I like that I'm able to call some of these guys my friends and colleagues. Also, I too hate Wix with a burning passion, just like Gavin does. So there's that. So another question I'm getting is, did I work out the technical issues with Dungeons and Devs? So I haven't really mentioned it during this stream, but I did mention last time I am working currently on a project called Dungeons and Devs, where I get you know game developers from various different places and companies together online for online games of D&D. We talk a little bit about our jobs and what we do and how we got in the game industry, and then we just play D&D for a couple hours. And the first issue had some, or the first episode had some audio issues, which that's what the first episode was supposed to help work out anyway. So at least that part was intentional. But unfortunately, some of the audio turned out to not be usable for that first episode, which is unfortunate. But that's what it's there for. I believe that I've gotten all those issues worked out. Part of the problem is that I'm using a multi-camera and multi-mic setup, so it makes it a little bit complicated to wrangle all of the different video and audio sources. And, I'm a character artist, not a sound or video engineer, so, there's a bit of a learning curve there, but I believe I've gotten everything worked out. The next episode, sort of episode 0.1, I guess, is going to be recorded not this weekend, but not this coming weekend, but the next weekend. That's going to be, let me see here, that'll be sometime between September 8th and 10th is when the next episode should be recorded, and I've got some cool people lined up for that. I know that people's schedules change and that type of thing, so I don't want to say, oh, this person or another is going to be on. But yeah, I've had a lot of really cool people show interest in this, and I'm excited to see what happens next for it. So I'm coming down to the last couple of minutes here, so if you guys have any more questions that you want to fire off real quick, please do so. If not, then thanks for coming and watching. Thanks for checking out all this stuff that I've been doing over the past month. I have a really enjoyable time whenever I am teaching people or answering questions or anything like that, and I find it very fulfilling because it means that I get to somehow help somebody with something, and that's a great feeling. It makes me feel like I'm actually being useful instead of just sitting on my rear. So thank you guys for tuning in. If you wanna check out more stuff like this, just search for me on YouTube. I have recordings from previous workshop that I did, which is all about materials. And if you want to check out future stuff, just keep an eye on this this Twitch channel, and also keep an eye on my Twitter, because I'm always posting announcements or updates about any projects that I'm working on Twitter. So if that sounds interesting, or if you use Twitter or whatever, just check out my stuff there. There's a link right down below the video to my my Twitter profile, and there's also a link to my ArtStation profile. So yeah, check it out if it sounds cool and interesting. Meanwhile, thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for watching. I'm really happy that I was able to do this for all of you, and it's been a great time. If you have any sort of feedback or anything, let me know. Through Twitter or something. If you have any questions that you want to ask, I always encourage people to ask questions in public, because it means that more people will be able to benefit from it. And if you have any sort of ideas for, say, future streams, or if there's something that's a specific topic where you'd like me to cover it in this type of format, I'd be more than happy to listen and consider that type of thing, because I like helping people, and I like getting in a situation where people have a lower barrier of entry between the stuff that they're doing in their personal time and somebody who's doing this for a living. I think that can be very helpful in a lot of cases. So yeah, thank you for tuning in once again. I know that I have had some minor technical issues during this whole thing, but hopefully they weren't too heinously awful, and hopefully you'll tune in for more stuff like this, or Dungeons and Devs, once it actually gets up and running with fewer glitches. So yeah, thanks a bunch, and I'm going to sign off now, get in the private hangout, and then call it the end of this one. So, you guys have a good night, and I'll see you later.